So these are the primary sources and other documents we should be familiar with. I don't think they ask specific questions about these, but they're good to know in the context of other related questions. So first we have A Civic Biology, Presented in Problems. It was a biology textbook written by George William Hunter, published in 1914. It is the book which the state of Tennessee required high school teachers to use in 1925. And is best known for its section about the evolution that was ruled by a local court to be in violation of the State Butler Act. It was for teaching from this textbook that John Scopes was brought to the trial in Dayton, Tennessee, in the Scopes monkey trial, and the views exposed in the book about evolution, race, and eugenics were common to the American progressives. Okay. In Crystal Eastman's speech, Now We Can Begin, Eastman, a socialist and feminist, considered what women should fight for following the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted American women the right to vote. She was one of the most visible progressive reformers of the early 20th century in the United States. She described herself as a militant idealist. She worked for suffrage and socialism and against war. Eastman was a feminist who believed that voting was the starting point for the real work of liberating women. Throughout her life, she sought to forge links among the many causes and organizations she supported. She argued that building a better world required understanding that the ways different forms of oppression overlapped and reinforce each other. Life is a big battle for the complete feminist, she said in 1918. This is the case against the Reds. In 1919, the Socialist Party in the United States split apart, with its radical members leaving to form the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party of the USA. Although small, the two parties launched aggressive campaigns to win workers to radical causes. That same year, a series of post war labor strikes, race riots, and bombings by anarchist groups led to a fury that became the country's first Red Scare. Members of Wilson's administration saw the strikes, riots, and bombings as the work of Bolshevik inspired campaign. Fearful of the growing appeal of these ideals in the United States, the Justice Department, under the leadership of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, seized the offensive in late 1919. The Palmer raids led to detaining of nearly 10,000 people and the arrest of 4,000 without due process of law. In this 1920 essay, Palmer defended his actions and explained why the threat of Bolshevism required extreme measures. Now we have A Flapper's Appeal to Parents. This one's really quick. By 1922, the flapper had become a full blown cultural phenomenon. In the following article, Ellen Wellis Page, a self described semi flapper, attempted to explain the appeal of the flapper and pleaded with American mothers and fathers not to reflexively judge their flapper daughters. This is Mencken's account of Scopes trial, widely known for his attacks on American Puritan tradition in its bourgeoisie. H.L. Mencken was perhaps the most influential American journalist of the first half of the 20th century and an ardent champion of such American writers such as Theodore Dreiser, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis, and Mark Twain. The Scopes Monkey Trial was the moniker journalist Mencken applied to the 1925 prosecution of a criminal action brought by the state of Tennessee against the high school teacher, Scopes, which we talked about earlier, for violating the state's Butler Act, which prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. In the case Scopes v. State, which was in 1925, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, but on appeal, the Supreme Court of Tennessee, pointing to a technicality in the issuance of the fine, overturned Scopes' conviction while finding the Butler Act constitutional. His coverage of the 1925 Scopes trial ridiculed defense attorney William Jennings Bryan for his peculiar imbecilities and theologic bilge. Alan Locke was a leading figure of the Harlem Renaissance. Alan Locke was born and raised in Philadelphia. He graduated from Harvard and continued his studies in Europe as the first African American Rhodes Scholar. After teaching English at Howard University for 4 years, he returned to Harvard in 1916 to begin work on a PhD in philosophy, which he obtained in 1918. He rejoined the Howard faculty and taught there till his retirement in 1953. In 1925, he edited a special edition of the magazine Survey Graphic, devoted exclusively to life in Harlem. He later expanded on its anthology, The New Negro, which became the manifesto of the Harlem Renaissance, or as some critics prefer to call it, the New Negro Movement. In the essay provided here, Locke captures the hope of and optimism of a people who have discovered a new vision of opportunity. The second KKK rose to prominence in the 1920s, and at its peak, it claimed millions of Americans as members. Klansmen wrapped themselves in the flag and the cross and proclaimed themselves the moral guardians of America. The organization appealed to many respectable, in quotes, middle class Americans. Here, Imperial Hiram Evans, a dentist from Dallas, Texas, outlines the Second Klan's potent mix of Americanism, Protestantism, and white supremacy. And I will quote something that he said in the book. He said, "There are three great racial interests, vital elements in both the historic and present attempts to build an America which shall fulfill the aspirations and justify the heroism of the men who made the nation. These are the instincts of loyalty to the white race, to the traditions of America, and to the spirit of Protestantism, which has been an essential part of Americanism ever since the days of Roanoke and Plymouth Rock. They're condensed into the Klan slogan, white, native, Protestant supremacy." And I think that that's a really important to note that their slogan was white, native, and Protestant supremacy. The next source is New York Times headline: Sacco and Vanzetti put to death early this morning. If you remember, these Italian immigrant anarchists were controversially accused of murdering Alessandro Berardelli and Frederick Parmenter, a guard and a paymaster, during the April 5th, 1920 armed robbery of the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company in Braintree, Massachusetts. The United States and Mexico share one of the longest international borders in the world. It's 1,951 miles long. The history of Mexican Americans' migration to the United States involves sharp shifts between periods of labor and shortages, when employers aggressively recruited cheap Mexican labor, and periods of intense anti Mexican sentiment, when many Mexicans and even Mexican Americans were deported or pressured to leave the country. Until the 1920s, the Mexican border was basically open. Mexicans were specifically excluded from the immigration quotas of 1921, and in 1924 that radically reduced immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Convinced that cheap Mexican laborers were indispensable to southwestern agriculture, Congress imposed no limit on immigration from the Western Hemisphere, though it did establish a patrol along the Mexican border and imposed an $8 head tax and a $10 visa fee. In this speech, delivered to the House of Representatives in 1928, Congressman John Box called for restrictions on Mexican immigration, which was unprecedented. The next slide is immigration restrictions again. Responding to the demands that Mexican migration be shut off, Ernesto Galarza, a Mexican American scholar, describes the problems that Mexican Americans face. He said, "I would ask for recognition of the Mexicans' contribution to the agricultural and industrial expansion of the Western United States. From Denver to Los Angeles and from the Imperial Valley to Portland, it is said an empire has been created largely by the brawn of the humble Mexican, who laid the rails and topped the beats and poured the cubic miles of cement. If it is true that the Mexican has brought to you arms and has fastened a civilization on the Pacific slope, then give him his due. If you give him his earned wage and he proves improvident, teach him otherwise. If he is tuberculous, cure him. If he falls into indigence, raise him. He has built you an empire." And that is where we will end the video.